Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Past Forward Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual conversation series where we discuss themes explored in our films with historians and experts. Today's Past Forward explores whether the First Amendment and its free speech protections make America more vulnerable to political extremism. It is inspired in part by our latest documentary film, Nazi-Town, USA, which is streaming now on our website and the PBS app. Nazi-Town, USA tells the story of the German-American Bund, a pro-Nazi group which in the 1930s had scores of chapters nationwide, representing what many believe was a real threat of fascism in the US. They held rallies with the KKK and ran camps for kids centered around Nazi ideology, melding patriotic values with virulent anti-Semitism. In today's conversation, our guests will discuss the contours of the First Amendment's free speech protections, considering if and how the First Amendment has been adapted to the modern digital age. The panel will also explore what role belief in free speech has played in the growing acceptance of social and political sentiments once considered extreme. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation, so I invite you to write questions in the live chat. We'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsor, Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, members of the Better Angels Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now, it is my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Mary Ann Franks is the Eugene L. and Barbara A. Bernard Professor in Intellectual Property, Technology, and Civil Rights Law at George Washington Law School. She is also the President and Legislative and Tech Policy Director of the nonprofit organization Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. Her areas of expertise include First and Second Amendment law and the intersection of civil rights and technology. Stephen J. Ross is a distinguished professor of history and director of the University of Southern California's Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life. His recent book, Hitler in Los Angeles: How Jews Foiled Nazi Plots Against Hollywood and America, was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History for 2018. The discussion will be moderated by Adrienne Lent Smith. Adrienne is an associate professor of history at Duke University, where she teaches courses on the civil rights movement, Black lives, modern America, and history in fact and fiction. She is the author of Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I, as well as numerous other scholarly articles and reviews. Thank you again, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Cameo, and welcome, Marianne and Steve. I'm honored to be here with you today to talk about the intersection between political extremism and the First Amendment, a discussion inspired in part, as Cameo George said, by American Experience's new film, Nazi-Town, USA. So I'm going to get us started with a question for you, Marianne, that just kind of sets a sort of the big base of understanding. Can you give us an overview of the protections, particularly around free speech and expression, included in the First Amendment? And as part of that, will you talk a little bit about to whom the First Amendment speaks and applies, and about whether there are misconceptions about what the First Amendment actually does?
There are lots of misconceptions about what the First Amendment does, in part because people have really strong intuitive feelings about what free speech is and what they're entitled to. So if we go back and we look at the text of the First Amendment, we see that it says, among other issues, because it deals with religion too, when it comes to speech, it says that Congress shall make no law that is abridging the freedom of speech, and also provides for protections of the press, peaceable assembly, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. So when we break that down, we realize that Congress here means the government. There's been modifications and clarifications to show that it's not just the federal government that's referred to here, but any state actor, any government actor. But that also makes clear that what the First Amendment protects is not an affirmative right to speak. It's not suggesting that the government owes you any kind of resources to speak, or that you're entitled to a particular audience or a platform. It's really a kind of negative right that says the government's not supposed to restrain you or punish you or prohibit your speech. So it's narrow in that sense. And then it's narrow in another sense that sometimes people are unaware of, which is that it really does just apply to the government. So if we're talking about private entities, non-government entities, like a bookstore or a university or a social media platform, and I should clarify with university, a private university versus a public one, those kinds of private institutions don't have First Amendment obligations. So you can't say to a bookstore that they have to publish your book, otherwise they're censoring you. And you can't demand that a social media platform honor your speech or accept whatever you want to say on the platform as a matter of First Amendment law, because the First Amendment doesn't provide for any restraint on those kinds of non-government actors. And in addition, when you are not a government actor, you are yourself a person or an institution that has your own free speech rights. And importantly, those free speech rights can also include things like, I don't want to speak with you. I don't want to associate with your speech. I don't want to promote your speech. And so what people get confused about sometimes is they think that they have some kind of constitutional entitlement to speak on these private platforms or in private places, but that isn't actually the case.
Gotcha. So the understanding, the intuitive sense of free speech is so central to, say, how many Americans imagine the sort of working of American democracy. What role does the right of free speech play in a democratic society? And can a government legally restrict speech and still be democratic?
When we think about why the right of free speech is so important for democracy, we often think about three major reasons. One is that truth is really important in a democracy. Our ability to be able to ask questions, to explore ideas in a really uninhibited way seems really important for retaining truth and discerning truth. And then we have a perception that it's also about the ability for people to develop their personalities, to figure out who they are and what kind of character they have. And so you have to be able to express yourself freely to be able to figure that out. And we think that that's important in a democracy. And then there's this really important idea that you have to understand and know about what your government is actually doing. You have to have a free flow of information that explains what the government is up to, and to be transparent and to be accountable to the people. And so you need to have really robust free speech protections in order to make that happen so that we can hold our government officials accountable. Now, that being said, democracies regulate free speech all the time. So we might have this perception that that means, well, you can't punish any kind of speech, but that's clearly not the case. We think about how in this country, longstanding, non-controversial assumption that you can regulate child pornography, for instance, that that is not considered a matter of free speech. Or think about the other big categories of obscenity or defamation or fraud, or more narrow categories like perjury or the privacy records, that privacy controls that say you can't reveal people's private information without their consent. There are all kinds of ways that the government actually regulates speech all the time. And mostly we think of that as being probably a good thing on balance. And the court doesn't express it quite like this, but if we were really trying to draw some parameters around what can you regulate and what can't you regulate for democracy, one way of speaking about this is to say, well, you make a kind of assessment of harm, right? That if we think that fraudulent defamatory speech is just really, really harmful, we're going to protect it less. If we think that child pornography is extremely harmful, we're not going to protect it at all. If we think some kinds of speech might be harmful in one context and not in another, we might set up regulations to accommodate that so that you can engage in maybe some really terrible racial slur kind of activity on the street corner, but you can't do it at work. So there are all kinds of ways for pro-democracy reasons that we do in fact regulate speech.
Got you. And Steve, I have a question for you, which is that historically, has the U.S. been unique or exceptional in protecting the rights of groups and individuals that oppose the government?
Yes and no. It would be a
That's
myth
always
to
the
say that
historian's answer.
Yes, it would be a myth to say that the United States has protected free speech. Let's go back a minute here, and I just want to add something that Marianne said, which is at the very core of free speech is something even more important, which is if we go back to the founding of the Republic, we need to remember that the American democracy is an experiment. And it's unclear whether this experiment will survive another 10 or 20 years. And part of the reason for free speech goes to the very founding of our republic. That for a republic to work, and this is where our, quote, founding fathers, Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington, Madison, Monroe, were all arguing, for a democracy, for a republic in particular to continue to exist, its citizens must educate themselves and participate in discussions about the most important issues of the day. You can't do that unless you have free speech. So at the very core of democracy and the very core of citizenship, we are a sovereign nation. We need to remember what that means is unlike anywhere in Europe in the 1700s, the American people own the nation. That is, we were the nation. It wasn't a king, it wasn't a queen, it wasn't a prince, it wasn't a princess, it wasn't any kind of royalty. And therefore, citizens need to be able to talk freely amongst themselves. What we have seen over the course of the years is, in fact, a government that has blocked free speech, largely through, I would argue, the FBI from its very beginning, certainly through the 1960s into the 1970s, prevented a free exchange of ideas in America. If you were on the right, you could say what you wanted. If you were on the left, you as a person would come under scrutiny, and your right to free speech would come under scrutiny. So it is a myth to say we have had free speech in our country since the beginning.
So, kind of in that vein, thinking about the places where speech comes under scrutiny or restrictions, Marianne, where does hate speech fall in this conversation and under the protections of the First Amendment?
Yeah, and it's a bit of a tricky question because as a legal category, hate speech isn't well defined. So other countries have definitions of hate speech that have been agreed upon, but in the United States, we don't actually have a legal definition of hate speech that makes clear what we're talking about. So what that means is that some of the things people think of when they think of hate speech, let's imagine, for instance, things like racial slurs or homophobic speech or what have you. If that's what people mean, then a lot of that is protected under the First Amendment, subject to some of those considerations about context, right, that I mentioned before. But a lot of those things that single people out for ridicule or dehumanization based on something like race or ethnicity or gender, those things are largely protected. But that being said, and even to the point that if you are calling for for violence against somebody or an entire group, that is largely protected under the First Amendment. So there are certain exceptions to this, but they are really, really narrow. But we protect a lot of really what a lot of people would call really violent kind of speech towards other people, unless it rises to the level of what is known as incitement. So if that's what people mean by hate speech, then that's largely protected. But there's lots of things like threats and so-called fighting words, which is a little bit of a strange category, or obscenity, which wouldn't be protected. So it really depends on exactly what it is we're getting at.
What are fighting words? Besides something that it sounds like Yosemite Sam would say?
Yes, it does, doesn't it? And it is this kind of idea that there are some words that are just so insulting and so provocative that their very utterance inflicts a kind of injury and would prompt people to violence, to want to fight. And the court used to be a lot more open to this idea that that was a thing that you could regulate. And the context of this is a case where someone's referred to as a fascist and a racketeer, and that's considered to be
Mm.
fighting words. And then you have a bunch of other cases where racial slurs are used, and the court says we don't think those are fighting words. So it's a very amorphous kind of doctrine that has more or less fallen out of fashion, but it still exists as at least a formal category of exception to the First Amendment.
Right. So, Marianne, you've said that the U.S., that other places have hate speech laws and we don't. Steve, you mentioned that historically, thinking about kind of surveillance and punishment, that in the U.S. the right has been more free to sort of express things, and sort of the left's statements have been seen more often as subversive. I'm wondering, does the U.S. stand out in its relationship to free speech over time for either negative or positive reasons? And that's a question for either one of you, really.
I think it does in some ways. We can say, back to this idea of really allowing really broad categories of speech, singling people out on the basis of their race and dehumanizing them, and even calling for violence against them unless it comes to the level of incitement. You could say that's pretty unusual. That's a pretty strong commitment to negative speech that other countries would not necessarily have. And some people think that that's evidence of something good about the First Amendment, and some would say that it's a sign of how bad things are. I think there's an argument for saying there's a couple of ways in which the First Amendment is unique and positive, in that you look at cases like West Virginia versus Barnett, which is where the court says you can't compel people to say things that are patriotic. So in that particular case, you can't force students in school to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I think this is one of those moments where the US does really well in terms of setting out a principle that says you can't force people to say something against their conscience. And you also have cases like Cohen v. California. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the F word on air, so I won't say it, but a very famous case involving F the draft, obscenity used in connection with the word the draft. And the court sets out this principle that says this is offensive to people, or at least to some people, but offensiveness is not enough by itself to merit punishment. So I think that's a pretty strong and unusual stance that's in favor of free speech. But there are at least two ways in which you can say, yes, the US stands out as a kind of outlier, and they're both bad. So one is that kind of overprotective idea. There's a case from last year, the Supreme Court says in Counterman versus Colorado, that if you are a stalker who's engaging in a course of conduct that is unwelcome to another person and objectively terrifying, but you personally believe that it shouldn't be terrifying to this person, and you really think that it might be welcome, that's protected speech by the protected by the First Amendment. And that seems like an overprotection. That seems really bad. And I would also point to echo something that Stephen was saying in terms of the U.S. standing out in terms of its underprotective nature for speech, because we have seen historically lots of instances where speech has been censored. And it's been censored especially for people who have been arguing for democracy. So if you look at the amount of censorship against anti-slavery literature, for instance, the burning of abolitionist press is another. The Comstock Act essentially saying you can't talk about birth control. And you even look today, obviously, at Republican agendas to try to take certain concepts completely out of schools, right? You can't talk about diversity, and you can't talk about accurate racial history. So I think in that sense, even though we have this reputation for being excessively or correctly deferential to free speech, it's a really selective protection.
I would just add something that Marianne was talking about before, which is incitement to violence, and that is a limit. So we take the 1960s, the mid-60s, people like Jesse B. Stoner, who is the founder of the National States Rights Party. He and one of his Christian warriors, the Reverend Connie Lynch, traveled throughout the South giving lectures on how to build bombs to blow up black churches, to blow up black homes, how to go out, how to make weapons as well, how to make homemade weapons. And many of those speeches were allowed, But in instances where they would give a speech calling for death to blacks, get out there and blow them up, and then there would be a subsequent incident right afterwards, they would in fact be arrested on a few occasions, just a few, for incitement to violence. But again, on the other hand, that's on the right, and on the left, you were not even allowed in the 1930s and 40s, before World War I. According to the FBI, you were not allowed even private speech to be free. That if you were discovered to have communist speech or alleged communist speech, you could wind up fired from your job, you could wind up in jail. So in terms of free speech has always been easier on the right than it has on the left. That's what I would say as a historian.
That is a good time to turn to a clip from our documentary. Let's look at the prologue of Nazi-Town, USA, where we see how the German-American Bund, which was a pro-Nazi group working on American soil in the years leading up to World War II, was able to openly pursue a fascist agenda in communities all over the country in the 30s. We'll go to it now.
In ever-increasing numbers, the nation's youth has been going away to camp. This year has seen more boys and girls at camp than ever before. All of them have enjoyed common experiences, common adventures, building muscle, learning fellowship, acquiring camp spirit.
It looked like any summer camp in America. It looked normal, but it wasn't normal. It was Nazi camp. In the 1930s, there were these camps all across the country.
They were indoctrinating centers. That's what they were for, as well as for protecting the purity and the health of your superior breed.
The camps were the creation of something called the German-American Bund. The Bund's vision was an America ruled by white Christians. And they thought that Nazism was entirely consistent with American ideals.
My fellow Americans, what would George Washington think and do were he alive today? Would he not plead with his thinking, the loyal and law-abiding people, the true Christian Americans?
The German-American Bund is after power. They're after influence within the very fabric of the United States. They want their ideas to become mainstream, and they want people to embrace those ideas.
They were against democracy and thought that America would be a kind of star in a constellation of pro-Nazi governments around the world.
We assume that democracy is something that all Americans embrace. But in the 1930s, there were people in the United States who were ready to try something different.
So, as we just saw, the German-American Bund used images of American patriotism, or sort of wrapped their political and social agendas in images and understandings of American patriotism. Is this part of a pattern, Steve? Is there a pattern in American history of extremist groups using patriotism to make their ideas seem more acceptable or mainstream, or even to understand their ideas as being patriotic?
Well, certainly in the 20th century, and certainly in the 1920s and 1930s, many of the far-right groups, isolationists, were all wrapping themselves, as I forget who mentioned it now, but if fascism, someone in the 30s wrote, if fascism were to come to America, it would be wrapped in the American flag. Thus the title of today's episode. And yes, from, I would argue, certainly the period I know the best, from the 30s through today, far right groups, more than far left groups, have wrapped themselves in Americana. The more patriotic the symbols, the more legitimate their struggles are. That they represent themselves as the true patriots. But here's the thing, they are not trying to fool you. They believe it. They're not being cynical and using this as cynicism. They believe that they are the patriots, and this is far right, and everyone else are naive, the dupes of those who are going to remove everything that is truly American. And therefore, and I would argue to today, you can't understand what went on January 6, 2021, without understanding that the vast bulk of people who marched on Washington truly believed they were the patriots of America, saving America from those who would undermine democracy, undermine the American experiment and everything. So again, it's not a cynical use. This to me is really what I've come away with in the last 10, 15 years of studying this, is to understand that these people see themselves as true patriots, that they are the inheritors. As Fritz Kuhn said, we are the inheritors of George Washington, not those liberals and lefties in America.
The political historian Gary Gerstle once wrote about the divided character of American nationalism, right? That you see this tension between creedal, the sort of nationalism wrapped, or civic nationalism around the American creed, and a sort of racial nationalism, and that different groups, some people have overlapping understandings, but some groups occupy the corners. As you said,
you have to add Christian nationalism. Yeah, you want to add
right.
Christian nationalism too.
Right, or maybe like some sort of identitarian nationalism. You mentioned that your area of specialization is the 30s, or sort of that's one of them, and that the boom, as we're talking about, comes in this Great Depression moment, right? So are we more likely, and I'll open this question up to you as well, Marianne, are we more likely to see, or historically have we more often seen anti-Semitic, xenophobic, racist, or otherwise divisive political movements during times of economic or political strife? And if your answer to that question is yes, could you sort of talk a little bit about why?
The answer is it's always been here. That's my answer. And that sometimes it's more visible, sometimes it isn't. I'm doing a book right now that's a follow-up to Hitler in Los Angeles, and it starts in 1945 and explains how we got from 1945 to the Capitol riots. And as the epilogue of my book is titled, "We've Always Been Here," that this has always been here. This hate, this racism, this anti-Semitism, what we see as something maybe unique to our own times or unique to the Depression. Yes, it gets much worse when people are searching for scapegoats. When people's jobs, when their housing are threatened, they look for excuses. They look for who's responsible for all this. And it gets even more intense. But it is always there. It has never gone away. The minute World War II ended, the Nazi movement in America revived itself. The minute World War II ended, the Ku Klux Klan, that had gone on abeyance for several years during the war, held their first big cross burning in October 1945. Yes, they suspended their activities for a while, but they never went away. And frankly, they're never going to go away. These are parts of what it also means to live in a democracy, is to live with people who hate you.
I'd only add to that yes, I think that certainly when you have other conditions of strife, it is true that when people are suffering, they're more inclined to look for people to blame. But that narrative and the script by which we identify the people who should be to blame is sort of always there, as Stephen is saying. It's not arising out of those moments. It's a pre-filled script to want to blame anyone other than our own systems, right? And the systems that tend to historically exploit people There's a whole story here too about how governments actively try to get individuals, vulnerable individuals in society, to turn on each other, right? The divide and conquer idea, rather than realizing that they're being exploited by some of the same forces. And so that does definitely come to the fore. And that's part of the reason why those in power who want to stay in power and to have their actions escape scrutiny, they want to constantly point their finger at certain groups and certain identities, because those will become the scapegoats during times of strife.
It's true. We're talking about sort of white supremacy in a particular moment with Nazi-town USA, but it's always important to keep in mind that white supremacy as a slogan in American politics at the turn of the previous century was about getting discontented white agrarians to fall in line with the Democratic program, or the program of the big D Democrats in the moment, rather than looking for commonality with other suffering folks across the color line in the American South. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the tactics used by extremist groups to spread their message and the legal methods the government can use to sort of counteract them or to monitor them. Let's take a look now at another clip from Nazi-town USA. Well, we will learn more about the FBI's investigation into the Bund and see some of the unsuccessful ways that states tried to stop the spread of American Nazism. So we'll cue that up now.
In the late summer of 1936, President Roosevelt calls J. Edgar Hoover, who's the head of the FBI, asking him to look into the activities of Nazis in the United States. One of the first things that the FBI sets out to investigate is the German-American Bund. Ultimately, the FBI produces a 1,000-page report, which really lays out some of the more outrageous aspects of this organization. The pro-Nazi imagery, the pro-Hitler sentiments, the anti-Semitism, all of it's there. But Hoover was not terribly interested in taking this on.
Why is Hoover sitting on his hands doing nothing with the Nazi fascist threat? The answer is actually pretty simple. It's because he was a rabid anti-communist.
The Communist Party of the United States is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life.
Like many Americans, Hoover thought, well, I don't really like fascism, but I do like its anti-communist credentials. So people tolerated organizations like the German-American Bund that were explicitly anti-communist.
We stand beside you as Christian soldiers in your valiant fight against Jewish communism.
There is a movement to stop hate speech. And in fact, the New Jersey legislature passes the race libel law. You can't libel somebody because of their race, their religion, their color.
This is in some ways a novel concept in law. The problem with this is that groups like the ACLU immediately become involved and raise the obvious constitutional objection of how can you possibly outlaw speech that is offensive to a particular group?
For all of the kind of horror of the idea of pro-Nazi forces acting in the United States, it's really not clear that they were breaking any particular federal law that existed at that point by engaging in the activities they were engaged in.
Ultimately, the big test for the race libel law comes because of Camp Nordland, the German-American Bund camp in the state of New Jersey, because of speeches that were defamatory towards the Jewish community.
We know that the Jew is most concerned with maintaining his stranglehold on the financial systems of the world.
Ultimately, there is a conviction of 9 Bund members for violating the race libel law, but that's struck down by the New Jersey State Supreme Court. In the end, the ACLU publishes a pamphlet defending their decision to defend the free speech of Nazis.
This is the double-edged sword of the First Amendment. It is a fundamental American right to be allowed to say horrible things. But the protection of the right to be hateful is what allows these ideas to proliferate.
So this clip feels relevant, right, to our, well, to many moments, including our current one. And we know that the question of free speech, including who's entitled to it and what platforms they use, remain fraught. Has the calling out of, I have two questions. One, has the calling out of free speech, or the sort of like calling upon it, become its own kind of political mallet? And are there other ways to counter, to sort of work with this double-edged sword besides government restriction, or sort of legal restriction?
Well, I can offer a couple of thoughts. I mean, the question of whether it's become more of a concept that is sort of selectively invoked. I think we have a long history of the selective invocation of free speech rights. Again, that there's this, we do tell ourselves this myth that the United States has always protected free speech, but when you really start to look, it's really not true. There's some speech that gets more protection than others. So that's part of the problem. So what are we seeing now? Well, we're seeing a situation where we're actually in a kind of interesting moment for actual equal access to freedom of speech. If you think about the founding era, you think about who actually writes the First Amendment and who they're writing it for. And even the conception of free speech as being one that the only thing that stops me from free speech is the government. So who are they writing for when the framers write that? If you are a woman or an enslaved person and you get this, and you're not considered one of the people, right? The idea that this is somehow the First Amendment is protecting your speech. You know, an enslaved person's right to free speech isn't being curtailed by the government. It's being curtailed by the person who purports to own them. A woman who's not allowed to speak in public or allowed to have a career that might conflict with her husband's because of conventions of coverture isn't facing government restriction of her speech. There's something much closer to home. So even when we're thinking about the American way that we've defined this, it's pretty clear that it was defined and constructed in a way to advantage certain people and wasn't even thinking about the rights of other people. So that's something important to keep in mind. We're now in an era where it's harder to maintain that entire parts of the population don't have equal rights to free speech, and they're starting to use them, right? And in the past, when women and non-white men were trying to advocate for their free speech rights, they were lynched, and their printing presses were burned, and they were suppressed, and they were subject to all kinds of forms of censorship. So what's happening now is you can't do that as overtly. So now the complaint, I think, has become that white men in particular are now complaining that they're being censored, when what they really mean is they're no longer the only voices in the room. So you saw this even in the Nazi rallies, the German American Bund saying, we want free speech for white men. The Jewish press is not letting us speak. And you're seeing that same kind of invocation of a persecution, this idea that because they don't hold on to 100% of the attention all the time, that other people are speaking and other people are criticizing them, becomes characterized as censorship. And so you start getting this invocation of a constitutional right for situations that really don't call for it. These are mostly situations where people are facing opposition where they never had to face opposition before. So it's definitely become, or it has continued to become, and is even more explicitly now, a political weapon.
I think we also want to ask, has the government been even-handed in its approach to free speech? And the answer is no, not for the 20th century. And again, I would point that free speech on the left has been restricted by the government, in particular by the FBI, where free speech on the right has by and large been given a free pass. And what I mean by that, something that I would imagine many audience members aren't aware of, but during the 1930s, so Hitler comes to power in January 1933. And starting then, a number of Americans began talking about open opposition to the Nazi regime that has proclaimed itself that it's going to persecute Jews, minorities, and political dissidents. During that time, you get something called the Anti-Nazi League that's formed. It starts in New York. In Los Angeles in 1936, movie stars opened their own branch, the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. And they try to, and this is both Democrats and Republicans who join, and their goal is to raise awareness of the threat to democracy by fascist regimes and Nazi regimes in Europe. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor is bombed. Once the war finally ends, and there are hearings held by the House Un-American Activities Committee, they decide that anyone who had spoken up against Hitler, remember, Tom Brokaw calls 1945 the good war and the greatest generation that emerged. The problem is those who spoke about the dangers of Nazism, the dangers of fascism, before December 7th, 1941, would be called up before Congress, accused of being a, quote, premature anti-fascist. Many of them then wound up losing their jobs, and some of them actually went to jail. So much for free speech. J. Edgar Hoover, despite the fact that his own FBI offices in Los Angeles had been repeatedly saying, please, the head of the Bund in Los Angeles, Hermann Schwinn, is the #2 Nazi in America, only behind Fritz Kuhn. He has called for all these horrible things. We know that he's plotting sabotage. We need to put him under surveillance. And Hoover writes back, because I have these records, Hermann Schwinn has broken no law, therefore you cannot put him under surveillance. But Hoover has had his FBI put all those premature anti-fascists under surveillance, even though they broke no law. So the American government, and I would say if you take a look at the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement in the 60s, it's the same thing. The forces on the right get a free pass. The forces on the left are, not only do they have free speech, but they are actually persecuted by the very government that proclaims to be a democracy.
Right. So we are going to turn to question and answer now, but I'll say that to sort of sum up, also what counts as right and left over the 20th century might shift, but one of the things that is unwavering is J. Edgar Hoover's expansive understanding of threat as being anyone who pushes for expanded access to American democracy. So our first question comes, I just wanted to get in a final Hoover dig before we turn to our conversation. Our first question is, to what extent does intent make a difference in how we understand free speech and respond to speech?
Well, it's a bit of a broad topic. The idea, broadly speaking, is that you do care about intent when it comes to things like incitement. So we've got this very strict standard that we've mentioned before that comes out of a case called Brandenburg. And in order to be able to distinguish between protected free speech, hateful speech that calls for violence, and illegal incitement speech, the speaker has to intend that imminent lawless action will take place, and it has to be likely that that imminent lawless action will happen. So much turns on the question of whether or not you intended that kind of immediate sort of violence to happen. And in that case that I mentioned before, this very recent case from last year, Counterman, same kind of idea where the court's saying, well, we're not going to punish stalking unless the stalker really, really intended to harass someone or to terrorize someone, even if the victim says, I was objectively terrified because this is repeated thousands of messages that are unwanted. So there's this very interesting deference to the intent of the speaker, which one could argue is an overprotection, because we can certainly see that in other aspects of the law, we don't necessarily defer so much to individual intent. We care more about the likely impact. But in this situation, we have erred very, very heavily on the side of whether or not someone's intent was very specifically designed for causing imminent, basically immediate lawless action.
So another participant asks where the right to assemble sort of falls in this conversation. Is it included in our understanding of, or it says this, and not just the right to assemble in protest. Does that fall under speech, or does that fall under First Amendment protections?
We're a little undeveloped in some ways in the First Amendment doctrine. The First Amendment does specifically mention the right of the people peaceably to assemble, so it's considered to be part of one of the protections that the First Amendment gives us, and we tend to think of it as being intertwined with the right to free speech, that your right to protest and the right to gather with other people and protest together. One of the things we have seen, though, in recent years, I mean, not just in recent years, we have also seen a resurgence in recent years of many attempts to try to limit the way that people can protest. We've seen these really alarming anti-speech protective kinds of regulations where there's much more broad discretion on the part of, for instance, people to drive their cars into protesters and to have no penalties for that. So we've seen some really unfortunate narrowing of what it means to peaceably protest and to protect that. And we've seen essentially kind of a, in some ways, in some states, like in Florida and other places, almost a deliberate encouragement of people to be violent against protesters. And of course, we think of the images from Charlottesville and other places, that this interruption of the right to peacefully protest and this notion of making it a very narrow right when we're worried about certain types of pro-democracy, pro-equality platforms, as opposed to the kinds of protests that often engage closely in violence. So for instance, the insurrection gets then sort of kind of downgraded to say, well, no, that was just people trying to protest. That was just people trying to express themselves, even though we see them breaking through police barriers and trespassing, et cetera. So again, there seems to always be this politicized framework on top of the interpretation of those rights.
Can y'all speak to how social media platforms intersect with freedom of speech? And this person asks specifically if deplatforming those with extremist beliefs is a form of censorship.
It's not a form of censorship according to the First Amendment. So again, echoing this idea that if we're talking about our constitutional rights, those don't extend to non-government actors. So as a matter of law, there is no such thing as a social media obligation to give someone a platform. And I would suggest that even more emphatically, the perception that we have, and something that we don't talk enough about, but that I think originally in the kind of balance that we're supposed to be striking between government restrictions and everyone else, is that government is restrained because government has all this power that any individual person doesn't have. And even when you're a social media platform, really powerful company, you're still not the government. You don't have that same kind of control. And that one argument for trying to deal with some of these really troubling forms of speech that are leading to violence is to say there's an obligation on the part of people who are not government actors to do things like ban accounts and to take down content, because you can't rest on the excuse that you have to keep this stuff up because of the First Amendment. You do not. In fact, you have, as a social media platform, just like any of us would have in our own homes or our own businesses, we have every right to say to a Nazi, get out, and you can't speak here. And I think it'd be very odd to characterize that as censorship. That is a person making their own decision about what kind of speech they choose to let their premises be a platform for. And we could use a lot more bravery right now, I think, from social media platforms to say there's certain types of speech that we have no interest in trying to promote because it's anti-democratic.
So a question that came alongside this one, which I think I actually hear the answer in there, is someone says, who's the watchdog on what speech is allowed and what isn't on the internet? Is it the sort of chief decency officer in the social media company itself? Is there someone beyond that?
Well, I mean, let's be realistic about who's actually calling the shots on any platform and why they're calling it. They're calling the shots according to what kind of content will get them more money. So I think we tend to romanticize the notion of a major platform that's making pro-democracy decisions, but let's face it, they're businesses. And despite whatever we might want them to do, whatever they might say that they're doing, What a business wants to do is to get more engagement, to get more profit. And what do we know from the research from the last years that have been exposed through whistleblowers and others is that the kind of content that gets you more money, that gets you more engagement, is really provocative, politicized, unpleasant content, not stuff that's informed or sophisticated or deeply civil. Those things don't really get you the clicks. The incentives are for things that are really offensive or upsetting or harmful or harassing. So there is no chief, there's nobody in charge, to the extent that social media companies distressingly are shaping our public discourse. We should be alarmed by that, because their motives right now seem primarily to be just profit and nothing else. And that doesn't seem like it's going to align very well with democracy either.
Let me take another approach on social media platforms, a historical one. In 1945, a week before Victory in Europe Day, which was May 8th, 1945, the leaders of the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and a group that no longer exists called the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League are all sitting in their Manhattan offices a few blocks from one another, and unbeknownst, they're all writing a memo at virtually the same time about what to expect in the post-war years. And they all write that we are going to see an upsurge in anti-Semitism, because all those people before the war said that the Jews are trying to get us into the war, and if they do, we're going to get them. Those people never disappeared, and there was an upsurge in anti-Semitism after the war. And in the memo, the interesting thing for me is each one of them said the same basic thing. We can deal with any hate group in America, even the Ku Klux Klan, which in 1945 was still the most prominent hate group in this country. Our greatest fear is that one day these dozens, and really it was hundreds of hate groups, are going to figure out a way to communicate with one another. And if they can figure out a way to communicate with one another, then we're really in trouble. And once they figure out a way to communicate with one another, the next thing that worries us more than anything else is that some of those hate group leaders are going to leave their hate group and join one of the two main political parties, and they're going to take these extremist ideas and work their way into the mainstream of one of the two American political parties, and then we're going to really be in big trouble. In 1945, that seemed like a pipe dream, but now we see that with the rise of social media, and particularly with a whole set of social media networks, these far-right groups are able, and we know from the congressional investigation of January 6th, they were communicating with each other in the months and weeks before January 6th. So those people were prescient about what would happen many years later.
And, pit stop at something like someone like David Duke doing quite well and running for governor of Louisiana in the 80s or 90s, right? So that observation leads to what might be, given our timing, the sort of last question from the audience, which is, would limiting freedom of speech have the desired effect of snuffing out extremist movements, or does the ideology spread regardless? And I think my sort of add-on to that question is, does it matter who does the limiting? In shaping the answer to that?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that anytime we ask that question, we're making some assumptions about how the current moment we live in is somehow not regulating freedom of speech, and that we need to start and we'll see what happens. And often that's asked in a way to say, oh, if you start censoring now, aren't you worried about X? And I think part of the themes that are coming out of this panel is to say, we have never been a country that has uniformly protected speech. We've always been a censorship country. It's just a question of who's been censored and who hasn't. So it's never, the options are never, should there not be any censorship, or should there be some, or should we protect free speech or not protect free speech? We've always been making these decisions in much more complicated ways, and here we are, right? So the question is, are there things that we can do differently that would lead to different results? And when we think about one of the major theories that the ACLU and others would try to promote about how you have to just let all the terrible stuff, all the And let's be clear, not offensive things. We're talking about now things that are dehumanizing, trying to say that an entire group is responsible for some kind of terrible crime and try to call for violence against them, to be clear about the kind of speech we're talking about. That the idea that the civil libertarian view would say is you have to let that view out there because it's kind of a pressure valve. It's going to make it so that we can critique it, we can counter speak to it, and then we'll resolve to truth, and then the Nazis go away. I think that was a fairly naive idea in 1939, and it's extremely naive at this point, or way past naive at this point. We now know that the safety valve theory just doesn't work. What you get when you normalize and you maximize and you put these big rallies in front of people where you scream about a certain group being responsible for all the ills and that they should be eliminated, you get what you get in Nazi Germany. You get extermination. That's where this is supposed to lead. Fascism starts this way. It has to start with speech. And so that's where we're headed now. The question is, are we willing to do anything at all to try to slow that process down?
Well, Adrian, to get your second question, I don't know who could ultimately limit free speech. Who is going to decide that? But what I do think is right now, I'm doing this from my office at University of Southern California. I think we can, I'm not a legal scholar, so Marianne, I'm going to get in trouble legally, I think. But I think there's a sense of common sense that we need on free speech, particularly free speech on campuses now, which is everyone should have a right, I'm speaking now as an individual, everyone should have a right to say what they believe. They should have a right to protest, but that right gets caught short or stopped short of calling for harm to another group. And I know one of the three presidents.
To a question. So this gets to a question that someone asked, and well, we're at the end. I will say, so I'm going to sort of pause and say that the final sort of one of the final questions that's sort of coming through right now is a question about whether free speech includes protections against violence. And then they clarify, I mean, if there is violence, does the free speech protection go out the window? I hear in your statement, no, it should not, right? That violates common sense. We have a minute for me to ask Marianne just to sort of informationally, legally, whether free speech goes out the window with violence.
So we have this standard from Brandenburg that says, if you are calling for violence and you intend, as the speaker calling for violence, you intend for it to incite people immediately to violent action, and it's likely that that is in fact how they will respond, the First Amendment does not protect you. Now, the problem, of course, is that when you think about the way that human behavior actually works, you think about the Nazi rallies, right? It's not as though you have a Hitler rally and that's immediately going to lead to the violence, but it's going to eventually lead to the violence. So if you have a standard that says it has to happen right away and everything up until that point is protected, then you have the problem we have now, which is people, especially nefarious speakers, know what the line is, and they're going to stay just on the side of the line. And so even if it's 10 minutes later, if it's the next day and violence breaks out, they're still protected. And now we have the internet that allows you to transmit that kind of message to millions of people who might take it a certain way and eventually take out their violence on someone. And right now, the First Amendment doctrine says that's still protected because it's not immediate.
So this is a fascinating conversation. I wish I could transport you both to Durham, North Carolina to have it with me in person. Of course, still with a live stream. We can do it in a cafe with a live stream. And I wish that we had more time, but we don't. So I'm just going to thank the both of you for joining this conversation today. Thank you for thinking about these issues with depth and nuance and knowledge. And I'll pass it back to Cameo. And thank you all for being here. And then I'll pass it back to Cameo for closing remarks.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring the relationship between political extremism and the First Amendment. Our film, Nazitown, USA, is now available to stream in full on our website and on the PBS app. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch new films live with us, and more. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.